Rat Facts, the M24 Chaffee. If you see my short rat facts, you'll know that I usually focus on vehicles that either ultimately didn't work out or didn't get used for very long. However, this is not the case with the M24 Chaffee. The Chaffee was put into service in 1944 and served in some countries like Uruguay until 2019. But how did such a long-serving tank come to be? Well, after the British combat in North Africa, it was quickly realized that a new light tank was needed to replace the M3 light tank, as attempts to upgun the existing M3 and M5 stores proved to have several shortcomings. In response, the T7 light tank was designed by the US to combat this issue, but it quickly grew in weight and decreased in speed, causing it to be reclassified as the medium tank M7. The program was ultimately stopped in March 1943 in favor of keeping the M4 Shermans that were already in service, and preventing the logistical issues that would come from adding a new medium tank to the theater. With the T7 program cancelled, there would be a request for a new light tank to be made in April 1943. Cadillac would be contacted to produce the new light tank, and it would be designated the Light Tank T24. The tank would have 5 crew with 2 drivers that could both control the tank. However, many crews would only have 4 people in the tank, with the co-driver leaving a seat acting as the loader if they entered combat. The tank would have 2 Cadillac V8s operating together through an automatic gearbox which gave it its good speed. The armament would be taken from a B-25, which was a lightweight version of the Sherman 75mm cannon. This gave it very good firepower for a light tank of its time and far outperformed the 37mm cannon the US had been using on their tanks up to that point. On October 15, 1943, the first vehicle would be delivered for testing and eventually judged to be a success. The military would contract the production of 1,000 tanks and would soon raise that number to 5,000. The tank would come to be named after United States Army General Adna Chaffee Jr., who helped develop the use of tanks for the US Armed Forces. He created the first armored division for the United States and developed the concept of mechanized warfare for the US Army. Not to mention, he would be recognized as the Army's finest horseman, which I think is the only thing cooler than having a tank named after you. The M24 would finally start to enter service in 1944, and by 1945 would be in full service, replacing the M3 and M5. However, due to its late introduction, it would see very little combat in World War II, with its most notable engagement being crossing the Rhine River and assisting in the Battle of the Bulge. The French would use the Chaffee to fight in Indochina in December 1953. Interestingly, to transport them, they would completely dismantle 10 M24s and fly them in as parts and reassemble them in a military depot. The 10 M24s would fire 15,000 shells in an infantry support role before the Viet Minh forces would finally defeat the garrison in May 1954. By then, the severely overworked M24s had been entirely worn out and badly damaged. The M24 would also see combat in the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. At the time, it was virtually the only tank the US Far East Command could immediately dispatch to help. One company of M24s would be taken from the 71st, 77th, 78th, and 79th Tank Battalion to fight against the North Koreans. This would leave Japan relatively vulnerable, as these companies were intended to fight in the streets of Japan should the island nation be invaded, but the risk was seen as insignificant compared to the war happening in Korea. However, the once powerful gun on the M24 proved to lack the penetration needed to fight the T-34-85, and fought at a large disadvantage to North Korean tanks. But this fighting was able to give enough time for the US to deploy M4A3E8s, which would relieve the M24s in August of the same year, allowing the battered and beat M24s to return to reconnaissance. It is also thought that the M24 may have been seen in service in the Iraq-Iran War, as both sides had the tanks, but there is no recorded evidence of its use. Even though the M41 Walker Bulldog was introduced to replace it in 1951, it would not be until the 1960s that the majority of them would be removed from NATO's armies. The US would create many different variants of the M24, including the light tank T-24E1. This used a Continental R975C4 engine and Spicer torque converted transmission, which performed better but had worse reliability, and the M19 multiple gun motor carriage, an AA variant that would have a twin 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun mounted at the rear of the vehicle. 904 of these would be ordered, but only 285 would be completed. And while it was developed for World War II, it only saw service in the Korean War. And finally, they also created the T-77 multiple gun motor carriage, an experimental AA version that would use 6 50 caliber machine guns and an armored turret. Other countries would also make their own versions of the Chaffee. As mentioned earlier, Uruguay used M24s and modernized them with new engines and a 76mm gun that could fire APFSDS that was in service until 2019. Also, the French would replace some of the M24's turrets with the AMX-13 turret, like they like to do with literally everything they've ever gotten in their possession. I guess in the end, it's safe to say that the M24 was a little tank with a big impact. I'm sorry, that was terrible.